Okay, lately I've been covering a lot of things that aren't exactly related to video games, but today I'm happy to finally be able to post my official review of Vrising because it's an incredible game with a massive number of positive attributes that I've put over 100 hours into already with no end in sight. The game is fantastic, and it's also an example of indie titles catapulting themselves into a mainstream spotlight, so without further ado, here is my official review of Vrising. First things first, the game is a blend of multiple different genres that haven't really been tied together before in concert, as far as I'm aware. There are top down ARPG style elements at play, similar to Diablo or Path of Exile, but there's also a splash of survival mechanics, similar to a Rust type game, which has been reinforced by a sort of Valheim esque boss progression system with PvE, PvP, and full loot server types. The bulk of my experience has been either PvP servers or full loot PvP servers, but this also allowed me to experience the basic PvE grinding loop as well numerous times, so I don't feel that my knowledge is any sort of incomplete despite not really focusing on the PvE only side of things. The basic gameplay loop is rather simple at first, mimicking what you might expect from other survival type games, where you craft progressively stronger gear, bone to copper to iron to dark silver and beyond, and slay progressively harder enemies. With a top down camera angle but direct line of sight fog of war, the game allows for some interesting combat maneuvers, it really does. You can successfully kite enemies in a way that is both necessary and difficult without the combat feeling broken or tedious, and that kind of balance is not exactly an easy thing to achieve. Logically, when talking about combat, we have to talk about bosses, because bosses are the way that you acquire your ability kit, and they're generally the core progression for the entire game. This is where it really shines. It truly does, because there are roughly 3 dozen different bosses of scaling difficulty spread across the significantly sized map. In the low level areas, these bosses are kind of easy. They award usually an ability or two for each unique kill, as well as a new building type, vampire power, or a few other things, but I won't spoil everything here in the review. And in the upper areas, they get significantly harder, as is to be expected, and they have diverse mechanics that are all incredibly unique, aside from a couple reskins. These abilities are, for the most part, the ones you get from bosses, pretty well balanced, with extremely unique effects. Some are far stronger than others, obviously, yes, particularly for specific boss encounters, but there's a distinct feeling that player skill is the ultimate keystone of combat. Solo play versus group play are wildly different, the dynamics are, obviously, with certain things like Sanguine Coil, a 3-charge damage projectile with a healing component, becoming a ridiculously strong early option when grouped together. There's other combinations as well, like Power Surge and Crimson Aegis or Aegis, which both allow shields and you can actually use them from very, very far away if you have line of sight, or not even direct line of sight, but if you can use them around walls from across the arena, I don't know. There's a very strong ability combinations, obviously, but with dozens of abilities, each uniquely crafted, the game has managed to land on its feet in terms of combat balancing. I could probably sit here and talk for 20 or 30 minutes straight about individual abilities and why they are so useful in various different circumstances, or how the PvP meta has begun to form around particular tactics and ultimates, but for most players this won't even be a consideration because when you master a set of abilities, even the worse, quote unquote, worse ones that have less overall damage or utility, you can still progress through content, engage with other players, and win if you have personal skill. And that is very important for an open world survival game. Suffice it to say, combat is pretty well balanced and mechanically diverse. It's definitely mechanically diverse, but there's also a large number of related systems that interact with combat. One of those systems is blood. Now, obviously, a vampire game called Vrising will have some sort of focus on blood, but the way that the developers have chosen to do this is actually very unique. Over the course of their time in the world, players will encounter enemies, each with their own blood percentage and type. As you begin to kill those enemies, you have an option to feed on them, and if you fully complete the feeding process, you will take on the archetypal blood of that character at the percentage shown. This is pretty straightforward, but things get interesting when you start to see just how powerful a blood percentage really is, and how that blood can interact with your skills, abilities, or even just general behavior. Example, Scholar Blood at 100%, which is difficult to find, I might add, can give your abilities a kind of repeating spell echo. Farmer Blood, or Gatherer Blood maybe, whatever it is, will dramatically increase your resource gathering potential, and Warrior Blood, particularly in PvP, will increase your ability to sustain and deal damage. There's more, those are just some examples. Juggling combat with your spread of abilities, weapon and personal, your ultimate, your vampire powers and forms, plus the ability to execute and adopt various different bloods, is an experience that leaves you with a sense of depth that, for me at least, was entirely unexpected but tremendously appreciated. It always feels like there is something else you can do to win an encounter. There is always another thing to try, or a way you could have improved your chances, leading to a kind of atmosphere where even the most difficult fights always feel winnable. They might take a very long time or require a few different adjustments, but outside of extremely large level jumps, where the enemy clearly is meant to be tackled with endgame gear and you just started 30 minutes ago, it always carried a sort of sense of possibility for me. Now, another system that feeds back into combat and general activities as well is the day-night cycle. In most games, day-night cycles are purely aesthetic. There is a bit of change in terms of visibility for those games, sometimes a mechanic where enemies get harder, etc. But in Vrising, the day-night cycle dramatically impacts what you can do and how you fight. The reason is pretty simple and seems annoying at first, but eventually, at least for me personally, it became a sort of respected change in strategy. I didn't love it necessarily, but I understood how to play around it and also what kind of benefits it could hold. The mechanic is just damage. Spend a certain amount of time in direct sunlight and take scaling damage until you die, and it's pretty fast once it starts. To prevent this, all you have to do is get to shade and out of direct sunlight, but what stands out the most here is how the map is designed, and how that simple process of breaking your exposure to the sun becomes an interwoven aspect of nearly all activities during the day. It is, quite frankly, astounding just how perfectly the development team have managed to populate the map, so that the sun is a difficulty adjustment, but not a death sentence. There is intermittent cloud cover, shifting shadow patterns, and destructible environments, to a point where your positioning rotates between kind of important at night and downright critical during the day. Winnable fights at night become heart-pumping encounters during the day. Boss encounters go from something rather predictable to a skill-based and satisfying dance that can result in some of the most tense yet enjoyable moments that a game has managed to create for quite some time, at least in my view. The simple idea of sun being eventually lethal, combined with a carefully crafted and populated world with proper verticality and vegetation, has pushed the game far beyond what it would have been otherwise, even if my first impression was that of annoyance at how the sunlight impacted my character. I didn't like it at first, but I eventually grew to appreciate it. After talking about the sun, we logically need to move on to base building, because your base is the default safest location for you during daytime. At first, you get wooden palisades and mist generators to stop the sun from beating down on you while you work inside. Eventually, you get the tools to build an entire Gothic castle, which can be pretty incredible, and as you explore the world, unlocking recipes and crafting stations, your home will grow to a size that feels daunting, impressive, and very satisfying. Small wooden enclosures become larger stone fortresses, and eventually massive sprawling courtyards, gardens, dungeons, and rooms. Your castle can lock down an entire peninsula of the map, with huge open sections and fortified entrances. Your castle can be smaller and compact, blocking off common travel routes and patterns, or isolating specific resource nodes and then you farm them because they regenerate for you in your base. You can have a protected base that mitigates the chances of being raided with honeycomb strategies and a bunch of different walls and doors, or a role-playing mansion that has crafting utility at its center. And that kind of freedom is honestly refreshing. The map is constructed in a way that there are raised sections and rampway entrances to dozens and dozens of absolutely perfect building locations. I have only chosen a few so far, but every time I play I see another spot that seems better and I keep thinking, wow, I want to replay and build my base over there. Working with a team, you can control enormous sections of land. But considering the fact that there is such a diverse selection of servers and game modes, PvE, PvP, and full loot, this kind of castle power becomes a benefit rather than a drawback. Now, for raiding, player versus player raiding, which you can do, different servers have different rules. It's typically a shorter window of time where it's allowed on PvP servers, but to actually do it, you need to create and control a siege golem, or actually just explosives for wooden castles or palisades, but a siege golem for big stone castles. It's not my favorite part of the game, and I would be willing to bet that it's damn near impossible as a solo player, but it's functional and it gets the job done. Break into someone's base, take all their loot, pretty standard stuff, but with so many other mechanical systems, Vrising, unlike many other survival type games, does not rely exclusively on raiding to drive player interactions. There are tons of systems I haven't even talked about. You can capture NPCs and imprison them in your base to be used as blood sources. Capture a 100% strength character, keep them happy enough and don't drain too much blood. That's an infinite supply of the game's most powerful buffs. Don't want to imprison the characters? Okay. Convert them. Put them in servant coffins, deck them out with gear, and send them on their own individual raid missions to areas of the map for tremendous resource gain. There's tons of things you can do. Having a hard time with any given boss? Rotate your abilities, or simply wait until that boss winds up fighting other NPCs, which will happen quite a bit more often than you might think. One example that comes to mind is a central area basically everybody goes here on every server, I won't spoil too much though, where a powerful boss fights a less powerful boss every couple of in-game days, where you can jump into a fully raging battle between two different types of NPCs. Werewolves come out at night and patrol roads where they fight with the militia. Vampire hunters wander the woods and battle the undead. Wolves will appear and attack other human NPCs, and so much more. The world of V Rising feels more alive than almost any other I have played in recent memory. You can leave your base and find just good loot sitting on the ground because a werewolf walked down the road and wiped out an entire pack of militia, which dropped an important recipe that you need for new gear. And you just find it because daylight came, the werewolf transformed back into a person, and then you happen to walk outside. The world exists without you. It really actually literally does. It functions on its own, and you log in to participate, but players are not the only focal point. They're important focal points, they're a big part of the world, but they're not the only important thing in the world. One complaint I do have, balancing for groups is completely botched. As soon as 2, 3, or 4 people join combat with the same boss enemy, they get a massive health bonus, the boss does, and particularly annoying is the ability for ad summons to ramp up out of control. If you fight a boss that, let's say, summons 7 skeletons alone, that's cool, that's all well and good, but when the same boss summons 45 skeletons because there are a couple more players, that's not as cool. It's not game-breaking per se, but it needs a lot of work, and it's one of the few things that break the immersion of a fully dynamic world that doesn't rely on your inputs to live and breathe. Eventually, you get to true endgame, which is shards. On one server, me and my duo partner got all 3 of the shards, and only on PvP servers, only one person can have the shard at a time, or one group. So we had all 3 of them, they're these big, buff-producing monoliths that you get after killing certain final bosses. And that was cool, but basically everyone quit that server because it was PvP, and we were by far the strongest with no one else having any sort of chance. It was a cool 3 to 4 day experience, and typically that won't happen. You won't run into people that are just so much stronger than you that you have no chance. Usually skill is the important factor, but when you have all of the endgame shards and you're already maxed out after 3 days, then yeah, it was time to find a new server and play again because that one had been basically conquered. Now, that point is rather important here. You can play a bunch of different ways. You can go for speedruns with a group, full loot PvP servers that last a lot longer, PvE with plenty of time to craft and meander around, or anything really, but choosing the right servers to play on and doing so in a way that supports your own playstyle is critical to get the most out of the game. You will quickly find out what playstyle it is that you have personally, and whatever it is, you'll find servers for it, but be aware that not every server will be enjoyable to every player. Bottom line, even if I have not fully discussed every single mechanic of the game, like silver coins that deal damage to you when you're carrying too many of them, and then a roaming trader where you go into human form to trade with him and he sells a bunch of cool things. Well, they're not that cool actually on the server I was on, but whatever. Or garlic exposure, like they're protecting farms with garlic and other things, or holy damage at the monastery, or whatever else. V Rising is an unexpectedly amazing game that is absolutely worth your time to buy, play, and enjoy. It's incredible. The development team deserves high praise for this. I'm still actively engaged with it and will be for quite some time. It's one of my main titles now. So it's an easy 9 out of 10 from me, with the only downside being a couple of individual balancing problems, right? Like certain stuff in PvP is going to become hyper meta. There are going to be certain mechanics like shielding from outside the boss's den and only having one person in combat inside and then rotating, so there's always a huge amount of shield on one player who then fights the boss, right? There's stuff that's going to happen, but all those things considered, as well as general performance, by the way, because it did crash a couple of times for me, and that was annoying. All things considered, easy 9 out of 10, could become a 10 out of 10. It's a fantastic game. Other than those few issues, I have nothing to say other than brilliant, love it, definitely check it out, and that's it. If you want to support the channel, there are links down below, primarily locals and Patreon to get away from AdSense, a YouTube alternative called Odyssey, another YouTuber to check out, merchandise, social media, etc., but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.